Okay, so today I wanted to talk about something called intelligent design, and it's going to cover a few grounds, a few topics, but it's mainly going to center around verse 22, where God says, "A secret refuge in God from Satan rejected. Among his signs are the creations of the heavens and the earth, and the variation in your tongue and your color. These are signs for the knowledgeable." We'll get to that first, God willing. So one of the issues that we have is that we're steeped in idolatry, and to the point that it becomes impossible to just say a simple fact such as God exists, that there is an eternal creator that initiated the heavens and the earth. If you were in a scientific community and you purport this idea, you might be laughed at, right? And they hold the view that they understand the realities that they ascribe themselves into, such that if you weren't scientific, if you didn't believe in science, whatever the qualities of science, you would be considered a fool, right? You don't understand enough. But what I'm going to show here, God willing, is that even the people they idolize and say extremely founded in knowledge, in truth, they themselves lacked the sufficient understanding to explain away all the problems. So we're going to start with something that Charles Darwin purported, which is the theory of evolution. And there is this concept in his evolutionary theory that everything that happens is by chance. So, for example, if you had a sheep in a specific environment and you had one that was born with a thicker wool and another one that had less so, and it was a cold environment, the one that had the thicker wool would survive. So his position is that by chance and by chance alone, the one that survives is the one that carries on the next offspring. And his idea is that every single species, every single known species, a platypus, a whale, an ant, you and me, we all stemmed from one single cell through these accidental evolutions through time. And it's based on the idea that these mutations happened at random, and the one that is most favorable will be selected. And that by chance would be the one that creates the next generation. Now, this idea, as much as it's a fine idea to say that we all stem from one original source, but Darwin himself had doubts. And this was presented by a guy called Stephen Meyer. In this book, he talks about Darwin's doubts. And in this book, it talks about how there's a guy called Louis Agassiz, a contemporary of Darwin himself. So Darwin presented his findings, and this person, Louis Agassiz, who was significantly, let's say, more renowned than Darwin, refuted his position. And what they cited was the idea that there was an explosion of life in the Cambrian period. So, there was dinosaurs, however many million years ago. There were also even more old fossil records. This is called the Cambrian Explosion. And in this period, this Cambrian period, there was a bevy of marine invertebrate life forms that were present in rock formations and so on and so forth, beautifully preserved. What you find in these formations, in these fossil records, is that each of these designs, there was like about 70,000 different species, they were all uniquely different to one another. They had profound template or design characteristics within their sort of underlying substrate. There's one of them is called a hallucinogen. I haven't presented it in this article, but it's so bizarre as a creation that it looks like it's something you hallucinate. Another one is called a brachiopod, and it has distinct features whereby it could basically suck kind of like a tusk, like the elephant's trunk. It can kind of do that, and it filters out the food that it needs. And then you also have animals with apparent ability of eyesight, all of a sudden being able to develop these qualities. Now, the life forms themselves were miraculous. This sudden expansion of these brilliant different variations of life forms. But the reason that there was doubt, and this person that cited that Darwin's theory was incomplete, and Darwin himself understood that it was incomplete, was something called the Precambrian precursor. So Darwin's theory is based on this tree, basically. This idea that everything started at this bottom here. Right? We're all started from one single-celled organism. Random mutation, random mutation, random mutation. Eventually, one stems into animals. Another one becomes plants. And I don't even know what this bit is in the middle, but they're all the different phyla, they call it. And what Darwin's issue is that for them to prove this theory, they had to find this point in the middle here. If you can see where my mouse is, this point is the bit that connects two different species, right? You might have an invertebrate that looks a specific way, and you have another one that is very similar, right? But this one doesn't have the trunk that can, suck food from the depths of the ocean, but this one does. So then you need something in the middle here. Something that is neither like the one with and without, but is similar enough that they would branch into these different versions. Like my analogy earlier, like if the sheep evolved from some different animal and there was another form of animal that's similar to the sheep, then you need something that connects the two together. Something that looks like one and the other, but neither one of them, but not actually one of them, right? And they would have to be further back in time. So one that looks like a sheep and another, I don't know, a goat or something like this. And the problem with that was that the more we dig into Earth fossil record, and this is something in the Ediacaran period here, which is further back than the Cambrian period, i.e. Precambrian period, they found that nothing connected the two different species, right? You got a species with like 7 vertebrae in them. I think it's called Sprigina. And then you've got another one that's entirely different. They're all just different lines on this tree branch, but there's nothing in between. Nothing that looks like one or the other that connects them to say that they branched from this node, that they expanded from a single source. And so the line was actually parallel. Each of the species, every time you go back in time, it shows another version of that species. Never another species that connects two different forms that they say are similar. And so this creates a problem for the people that purport that we all just evolved by chance. One is that the time frame for us to evolve by chance is significantly more needed than the time that was present. So the different species that were found in the Cambrian period was about 450 million years ago. There was a 50 million year gap between that period and the Ediacaran period, which is the period prior to it. And they found that in that distance, let's say this is a 50 million year gap, they couldn't find a single species that connected those other versions or variations. And the problem is 50 million years is not enough. From their analysis, they called it, I think the deep dive theory or something like this, that it was so far back that we don't even have access to the records. They even stated that some of them were soft-bodied shells. That's why it wasn't preserved. But it's not true. We found records in fossil before this explosion of life that were soft-bodied, beautifully preserved. And it still doesn't prove the theory. So it wasn't the fact that animals couldn't evolve or be designed into a different, criteria. It was the fact that there wasn't enough time for it to happen by chance. That's the key word. This didn't happen by chance. The only way that it would start from, one single organism, right, one single cell, to become all the beautiful variations of animals in existence today is if it was guided by an intelligent creator. This is the only explanation, because you have to build so many different things in the design or the template of the species before it could even be that species, right? You can't just say, oh, if it's cold and it just gets woollier, that sheep survives. No, it's more in depth than that. They have to expand complex articulation of the biological systems that has to know exactly what it has to evolve in exactly the right time for exactly a situation it doesn't even know it's going to face, right? And the idea is that this theory is basically nonsense. You can have microevolutions, right? You can have different versions of people. For example, you and me might be different in color, in size, in how we speak, our hair color. Everything about us could have micro variations. But to say that you and a monkey are the same would be hilarious, right? To say me and, I don't know, a dog stem from the same origin is also hilarious. We are distinct species, and we don't have any qualities that are similar because God had guided each of these processes such that it needed the least amount of time to become the microevolution, right? A dog can have different breeds and so on and so forth. It can have this microevolution, but it can't, in 1,000 years, in 1,000 million years, it can't then become a dinosaur. That's impossible. And the analogy he used is that imagine you enter a room, a warehouse, and you see a bicycle and a submarine, right? We understand that they're both made of metal in some way. Now, imagine instead of having the bicycle and the submarine, you just have metal, all the components to make both of these things. And you just give it 200 billion years, right? By chance alone, not even the bicycle would form, right? You can throw wind at it, you can throw rocks at it, you can do any number of things. Metal will not form into gears, will not form into fixings that will self-assemble to become a bike, let alone a submarine next to it, right? With transistors and complex communication systems and all these complex things that were controlled and designed by humans to achieve the function that they were to achieve. And it's the same here. There's not enough time in existence for any of these things to happen by chance. It's impossible. The only answer is direct design. So Darwin had doubts, but people who want to believe that God doesn't exist, they don't have doubts. They latch on to this idea that had no substrate, that was basically disproven, and they say, yep, that proves that God doesn't exist, which is hilarious. There's a verse in the Quran where God clarifies the processes of human creation, right? Where the alaka is used. This is basically a leech-like substance or a zygote. And then you continue to the cleavage, where the cell multiplies within a single domain, right? It increases in complexity, but not in size. It multiplies, but it doesn't become bigger. And somehow or other, yeah. So then the cell, as it multiplies, it has to choose somehow to know that I'm going to make a tissue cell, right? Skin cell. I'm going to make organ cell. I'm going to make the cell for eyesight, the nerve cell. These are distinct functions and distinct cells that they somehow know to select and make. Okay, so I'll continue to the next section. The next section talks about something called morphic resonance. So this theory that science is perfect, that it explains everything, and specifically that science has some dogmas where they say that everything is bounded by material, right? You don't exist. It's just chemical processes in your brain, neurons firing, so on and so forth, right? Your consciousness, your existence is a creation of the mind. And so the scientific dogma is such that everything is explainable by science, that everything has, in principle, been explained. We just have to tweak the different points or minutiae of debate. And Rupert Sheldrake, he wrote a book where in America, I think it's called Science Challenge or Science Unbound or something like this. And I think in the UK, it's The Science Delusion. And in his book, he clarifies that there are 10 dogmas or 10 ideas in science that we accept as truth, but there isn't proof that they are absolutely true. For example, one of the things that he challenged is the idea that there is this thing called G. This is the gravitational constant. So in physics, the gravitational constant describes, it's a fixed number the relation between the gravitational reaction between two masses. For example, if this is Earth on the left and this is the moon on the right, then the force that pulls them together is basically in proportion to the radius squared, this distance squared. So the further away you are, the distance affects this force by a factor or an exponent of 2, right? So an increase in double means it's 4 times weaker, the gravitational force. And an increase in the mass of 1 increases it by 1 times that factor. And G is this random, it's not random, but it's a specific constant that makes this equation work. If you multiply the mass of M1 and M2 divided by the distance apart between them squared, if you multiply it by G, you will get exactly the force in newtons that is exerted between these two these two bodies. Now, what he found was that in the past, around 1930s, 1940s, these figures were recorded in the labs as different figures entirely. In one lab, they might be 6.673, in another lab, 6.675, whatever, right? And it's a constant. So how can it be different? Like when I had to do my physics exam a long time ago, this is just written in the book as a specific figure, 6.674, whatever it is. And you just use that constant in the equation. You get the answer, you're done. Now, how did they resolve these differences? When they went to measure to find what the constants, they were different between each points, between time. And instead of trying to find out why it's different, they decided that was too much of an effort, and they just defined it as a value. So G is now a constant by definition, right? You can't find a different value in the labs. It doesn't matter what you do to find this figure, which you can. You can do this exercise if you had the right lab equipment and so on. You can find a different value of G. The precision of which you find it is dependent on how precise your equipment is. But now you can never redefine G, because G has been defined by the scientific community, right? They meet up 10 years or so and they define these figures. And it's the same with the speed of light. In 1920, 1930s, they found that the speed of light changed for some reason. And there could be explanations to this. There could be a faraway galaxy that exploded in a supernova, and it shifted the spatial density such that light appeared to have changed in a specific setting. But instead of trying to explain it or find out if there are indeed these events that are causing the values of light to be different, they've made that definition a certainty, right? They made light a definition of a specific value. And then everything else is built on that. The measure of 1 meter is based on light. So how can you say this is the truth when you've just ascribed it as the truth? And this dogma extends, right? He expands on 10 different dogmas in science that he says effectively it's a belief system. The people that come in this position, they might have PhDs and whatever else, they might be articulate, but it doesn't explain the fact that they don't themselves understand that this is a belief system, right? The reality behind that belief system is such that you could question the underground or the floor that they're sitting on, such as G being a constant. If you measure it, it wouldn't be a constant. It could change. Light could also change. And one of the things that always bugged me when I was studying astrophysics long time ago was this concept of dark matter and dark energy. And in physics, there's this term of dark matter and dark energy. As per this description of, universal constant, what tends to happen is that the more mass there is in the universe, the more attracted they are to some single source, probably a singularity in that galaxy or a black hole, effectively. And the problem is the amount of mass, for example, in Milky Way is insufficient to hold us together. With the amount of planets, stars, everything else that exists in our entire galaxy, the Milky Way, we should, in theory, just fly off. There's not enough mass to hold us together. But instead, we don't fly off. So how do they explain this? Easy. They created a concept called dark matter, such that dark matter, there's matter that they simply cannot detect, no matter what they do, no matter how they analyze and advanced equipment that they try to find in space and everything else. They cannot detect dark matter, but there is. And this dark matter accounts for 90 to 95% of the matter of the galaxy, which means the accuracy of our understanding thus far without this dark matter is only 5% of the entire picture. And it gets worse. If you then have all this dark matter, you now have a significant amount of mass that you cannot attribute or measure or see. They should, by definition, just collapse. But yet that doesn't happen. The galaxy works in such a way that we have this precise balance between the forces that resist the gravitational attraction, as well as the masses balanced towards that force. So how did they explain this? They created another concept, dark energy. Dark energy is the uncounted, invisible energy that repels the dark matter. So with a brush of as Rupert Sheldrake said, with a stroke of a pen, they explained away entirely a problem that they don't even understand, right? It is more logical to say that there is a being in control, literally, of the heavens and the earth, right? Within a precise and calculated movement within his decree. For all we know, God is managing that, maybe through his angels in a higher dimension, in a specific way. We can't even begin to tell. But the fact that the science community is readily creating terms that don't have any basis, that don't have any proof, any foundation, and saying, that's it, I've solved it. This shows that they are disingenuous at heart. I studied this for a living, and I'm an engineer as a profession. It's not like I'm talking as if I hate science. I use this on a regular basis. But the point is this: for you to say that I believe in these scientific ideas, therefore I'm more intelligent, and therefore God doesn't exist, is not a form of intelligence, is not a form of sincere approach to the truth. The truth is there is many, many things that are gaping in the scientific community, in our understanding of the reality of life. And I'll go as a side point, it's not in this article, but specifically Roger Penrose's calculation of the initial Big Bang. He explains that he worked with Stephen Hawking and I think a guy called Ellis, all PhD physicists and mathematicians. He explained that you can reverse the calculation backwards in time using something called entropy, which is a measure of disorder. If you go into your room now and you leave it for 100 days, it's going to get messier naturally, right? Through your day-to-day errands. And it's the same in the universe. Without something being prescribed as a method of control, as a method of direction, everything tends towards chaos. Now, this is entropy effectively, and you can measure entropy. In the background, in the background radiation, they call it, there's something called the Boltzmann constant, which is the temperature that just exists even in space. It's not exactly zero. It's not absolutely zero. Something like 10 to the minus 43 or 7 or something like that. It's a very, very small temperature, but it exists. And what you can do is you can work backwards from the temperatures in the entire universe and the eventuality of the universe collapsing into itself, right? This is one of the views of physics. You can calculate what is necessary to initiate the entirety of the universe. This is the Big Bang. And based on their calculation, they explain that there are phase spaces that everything has to be balanced precisely. This calculation pointed to a number which is 10 to the 10 to the 123. This number is so vast, it is impossible to even explain, right? The best way I've tried to explain this is like this. An exponent over itself completely dwarfs everything prior to it. So if I said 10 to the 3, this is 1,000. If I said 10 to the 10 to the 3, this is 1 followed by 1,000 zeros, right? If I said there's 1,000 cars outside your house right now, you can imagine that amount of cars. That's a lot, but that's not like a major number. Right? It's not going to completely take over the whole planet. Now, if I said there's 1,000 zeros of cars outside your house, that is more than the number of atoms in the universe. If every atom in the universe is a car, the entire universe would be populated with cars alone, right? And that is nowhere near 1,000 zeros. That's only 80 zeros. So that's just the scale of 10 to the 10 to the 3. Now, for every time the exponent increases, if I say 10 to the 10 to the 4, it's 10 times the previous number, right? If you had $1 billion and I had $10 billion, to me it's as if you have $1 and I have $10, right? The difference between the amount you have to the amount I have becomes more significant in the exponent, because every time it's times by 10. And more specifically, because it's in the exponent, it's the number of zeros being times by 10, which is even crazier. Now, he presented, and he has no reason to present this, because Stephen Hawking is effectively, I think, is an atheist. The figure is such that there had to be a precise tuning by a divine, intelligent creator for the universe to even exist, for the laws of physics, the second laws of thermodynamics, everything that we're talking about, for it to even be the space that God had to work with is 10 to the 10 to the 123. That's the improbability. But yet here we are, right, ready to say God doesn't exist, ready to equate a partner to him, when this can only be done by God. This can only be explained by a divine creator. That's the only logical assumption. I'll move on because I didn't want to delve onto that too much. So here's the next part. This is the bit that I wanted to relate it to, the pattern that I saw, which is that this applies to language, right? God says, and I'm going to skip all the way to the end to talk about this. In 30:22, I seek refuge in God from Satan the rejected. Among his proofs are the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the variation in your languages and your colors. And these are signs for the knowledgeable. 30:22. So we talked about the creation of the heavens and the earth, right? The fine-tuning that is necessary is such that we can't even begin to imagine the improbability of this outcome. There's a presentation we're working on. It's about the improbability of the basmala occurring in exactly 19 verses, right? And this improbability is so profound, it's 1 in 10 to the 1,000. This is 1,000 zeros, 1 followed by 1,000 zeros. That's how improbable it is to find exactly the words Ism, Allah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim in the occurrences such that it's 19 verses of the Quran. Therefore, it must be by design. It's not by chance. And the improbability is such that if you imagine, this is just this improbability of the basmala at the moment, if you imagine finding a single atom in the entire universe. Let's say you took a ticket of a lottery, right? All of us bought a ticket to win the lottery, but instead of 1 in 2 million chance of winning, or 1 in 1 million, or 1 in 700,000, it doesn't matter. Your chance of winning is 1 in 10 to the 80. That's 1 followed by 80 zeros. That's the number of atoms in the universe, by estimation. And you buy this ticket, right? Your chances of winning is 1 in 1 followed by 80 zeros. That's minuscule. That's non-existent. You will never win. You could play this lottery the entirety of the length of the universe, like all of us combined could play this lottery for the lifetime of the universe, and we would still not win, right? The probability that Ism, Ar-Rahman, Allah, Ar-Rahim appears in exactly 19 verses in the Quran is such that you would have to win this lottery 12 times in succession. So imagine you do win the lottery. You buy the ticket, you win. You found the 1 atom out of 10 to the 80. Now, if you imagine this atom becomes its own universe, you have to do this again. You have to find another atom in that other universe, 10 to the 80 again. Then you have to win the lottery again and again and again and again. You have to win the lottery 12 times. And even after winning the lottery 12 times, you are nowhere near the improbability of this randomly occurring in 19 verses. That shows it's by design. Now, talking about the creations and the heavens and the earth, the bit we talked about earlier, is 10 to the 10 to the 123. This is beyond that improbability I talked about. It's so beyond. I wouldn't even try to explain how much further that is from this position. God is clarifying in this verse that this sign, the fact that there is no other that could do this other than God himself, is reflected in the variation in our languages and our color, right? And now I'll go to the Chomsky's universal grammar and language. So back in the day, there's this theory in psychology that language is a behaviorist trait. You learn through the environment. I have a young son and he's learning language right now. He only says 3 words. But the idea that they used to have is that because of the inflicting environment, the child then learns from the stimulus and then responds, right? You start saying bye enough times and you leave the room, they're going to register, oh, because this happens, I'm now going to say bye when I have to leave the room or when they leave the room. Right? This is the same idea, you'll notice, as what Darwin is purporting. By chance, this person, this child, will learn language. Now, Chomsky came along and he expanded on this and he said that this is insufficient to explain the complexities in the language that children can use when they haven't even heard a specific grammar being used. For example, just now, before I came to do this presentation, my daughter started trying to inflect in past tense a specific word, right? Instead of grow, present continuous, grew. She never even heard that word before. I mean, maybe she has, but never in the context that it would apply in her environment. So she has an intrinsic understanding in a way that language should be used. What she has uncovered isn't the word themselves, but there is an underlying layer or mapping to the grammar in the language. And what Chomsky proposes, basically, is that these languages form an innate wiring in the brain, that this had to already exist in our brain to explain why languages are easily acquired by kids specifically. And in psychology, you learn as well that there is a cutoff point, that if you don't learn after a specific point, around 12, 13, 14, it's kind of like imprinting. I can't remember the animal. It's ducks or swans or something. That if they don't imprint beyond a certain point, that's it. It's too late. They're not going to recognize the mother and everything else. It's the same with language. There's a point that if you don't learn language before this point, it's game over. Right. So expanding on this, the language acquisition, according to Chomsky, is that there's an innate wiring in your brain that makes it easy for you to learn language, right? But it still doesn't explain why. Why do you have an innate understanding of language? Right. The same way that the phyla branched out into all these different species, animals, plants. They want to say that language started from a single stem, i.e. this trunk of the tree, and then eventually it branched into all the variations in our language, right? By chance. That's the main thing. Again, because one guy spoke a certain way and he's in a specific environment, this then forms a whole new language, right? Chinese or Indian or Japanese or Malay, my mother tongue, or Russian, or Ukrainian, or English, or Lithuanian. Doesn't matter. The problem is, again, time, right? Human history is such that we haven't had a lot of time to develop such complex nuances in each of the languages. And for every point in time that you go back to, right, if you're looking at some Proto-Semitic languages or anything like this, you find that the complexities within the grammar rules existed then. You didn't start from a language that was basic, nonsensical, in 1 or 2 words, right? Me eat food, or something like this, and then eventually it grew into more complex criteria. It already started as complex systems. The systems of communication, the grammar rules and everything else started existingly, even as far back as we can imagine, already as these complex forms of communication. How can that be? If not for the fact that these are guided events per God's explanation in 30:22. This sign mirrors the signs of the creation of the universe, the microevolution of our language. Like Chomsky's understanding of the universal grammar, as much as it helps, it doesn't explain why there is an innate understanding or wiring in the brain to understand language innately. Furthermore, like you said, for example, my kids, they're immediately grown into an environment where they're speaking 3 languages. I speak Malay, English. My partner speaks Lithuanian, English. And I've known people that learn 6 simultaneously because of the combination of their parents. And if you have an innate wiring for a specific language, why then that you have an innate wiring for another language or another language or another language? But his point was that these language acquisitions is a universal trait. And this is the point that is being refuted. He's saying that there is a stem of language, much like there is a stem of evolutionary traits that eventually by accident mutate into different branching species in all these different phyla. His position is that there is one node that everyone starts from. But this is untrue. If you've ever tried to learn a new language, for example, now, Chinese, or if you've ever tried to pick up Arabic, for example, at a later stage in time, it is much, much harder for you to pick up the context and the rules within those subsets, right? And this is, again, mirroring your point, the fact that there is fluidity in the intelligence of the brain. So you start off from, over time, actually up to the age of maturity, your brain solidifies. It's harder for you to be flexible in your understanding and newer acquisitions of knowledge. But as you said, for a kid, there's better fluid intelligence. And there's also this concept in psychology that the more complex a presentation, a word or a verse or a statement, the easier it is to remember. I did this study myself where we had to hand out a bunch of questions to people who were willing to participate. And it was a form of questions, for example, Jenny likes cereal, right? 3-word liners, and you continue 10 sort of questions like that, and they just fill in the words in between. And then in the back of the page, another set of questions, another set of statements that are more complex. Jenny, who lives down the road from John, has a pale complexion. She visits John every Wednesday, and in their meeting, they always have breakfast together at 8 a.m. Right? Simple, complex statements. And then whenever you ask the people that have finished these statements, right, do you remember who had breakfast at 8? Or do you remember what happened at 8? They immediately remember, they had breakfast. I think it was Jenny around 8 o'clock, something like this. And it's the reverse is untrue. If you just ask them with that simple statement, Jenny eats cereal, or Jenny likes cereal. Do you remember what Jenny likes? I don't remember. There was 20 different statements of these short points that didn't build into anything. I don't know. Jenny likes the sky. So you see a correlation between a complex statement with memory retention. And that also relates to how it works for kids. For example, when I read my daughter a bedtime story, for her, a lot of the words that I'm presenting are more complex, and it's the first time she's heard it, right? One of the words is like astounding. So I'll start the words of the statement, whatever it is. And because I'm so used to certain presentations of words and everything else, the salient points to me, the things that are significant, are different to her, right? So whenever we can read this book, I've read it enough times that I can read it from memory, but I sometimes need her to initiate me, because those simple statements in the beginning, I don't remember, right? Because it's like a mouse strolls in the wood. For her, this is a complex statement. So there's this interesting interplay between complexity for them and what you decide to retain, because for you, it was something trivial, and so you discard it, right? You retain after reading a book, whatever it is, the major points, right? You don't get hung up on a specific word being used. But for them, if this is the first encountering of that specific word, it's significant. They're thinking, oh, how can I use this word in my day-to-day, right? And the position that I'm trying to explain here, specifically with 3022, is that language is similar in the sense that they may have had Adam, for example, would have had a specific language that then evolved into variations in our tongue that we have today. But given sufficient time and chance alone, we could not have possibly arrived to the position we have today, because there would be a host of grammatical issues in the template that people would have used 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. But instead, every time we go back, we find nuance in the grammar and the structure that existed then, which means that the template existed, right? Someone, something, a being, possibly a creator of divine origin, had to design and guide these events such that it would happen within the frame of 50,000 years or whatever the duration of man's starting point from speaking to where we are now. So the position I'm making is that 3022 relates specifically to this this idea that these are guided events. Much like we would have microevolution, we could have micro variations in our languages, but not an entirety of a different language.